Hello, hey everyone. First of all, thank you all for joining. I hope that everyone is doing well. With the corona and everything going on, a lot of people are getting affected. A lot of jobs are getting affected. I hope that things get better soon. So first of all, thank you all for coming. We'll be discussing about the JAMStack. So JAMStack is the topic that is close to my heart. So I do a lot of side projects and a lot of applications for fun and as well as for the job at the work. And I love the JAMStack as compared to the other stacks that have been common. And I'll be discussing why is it so and why you would want to consider JAMStack for your next project. So first of all, about me, I am Kamran. So I am working as an engineering manager at trading.com in Dubai, which is a B2B platform for the MENA region. So if you might have known, you might know about Alibaba. So Alibaba is mainly the same kind of concept, B2B, but they are targeting the Europe and all over the world. But we are mainly targeting the B2B region. I'm currently based in Dubai, but I'm basically from Pakistan. Also, I have worked in Germany for some time. I was part of the Jebel before, and now I'm working here at Trilling. I am very much into the open source and community. I do a lot of community work. I have built a lot of open source projects. I do a lot of mentorship, and I love building and teaching stuff. And I always have a side project going on because this is the way I think that everybody should have. I mean, all the developers, if they want to learn and grow, they should always have a side project. And I'm also teaching at egghead.io. I make a lot of free content there. So Egghead is a platform where the developers teach. So I have a lot of free content for the developers to learn from there. I have been working mainly in the startups before, and I love startups more than the corporate jobs. And that's it. And if I talk about the community contributions, I have a lot of open source projects. You might know me from some of the publications. So, for example, design patterns. So I have this text document that explains the design patterns in the simplest form. So if you're not able to understand, I can assure you that if you go and read this, you'll be able to get the idea about the design patterns. I also have a couple of other projects that are quite famous. My most famous project is the developer roadmap, which is among the top 11 most starred projects. So it is the 11th most starred project on GitHub. So it has around 113,000 stars on GitHub. It has helped a lot of developers, and it's mainly about the roadmap. So this is how they look like. So I have the roadmaps for the front end, the back end, the DevOps, so Android. If you want to get into any of these fields, how you can do that. So it's mainly about these roadmaps. And one of the topics, I am covering the JAMStack because I have been very much into the modern ways of building stuff. So I do my research. I do a lot of surveys before publishing these roadmaps, and I have been seeing the surge in more and more the JavaScript application and the JAMStack applications. And I'll cover that more, like why is that. Also on my Twitter, I also public every Thursday. I public infographic like this explaining the complex topics. I have around 30 topics at the moment, and I put one every week, every Thursday. Roadmaps and guides you can find at this roadmap.sh website. I also teach at the egghead.io and the YouTube channel. You can find me here. And I also mentor developers, and I have ongoing mentorship for a lot of developers. So what are we going to cover? As I said, I mean, JAMStack is closer to my heart. I do a lot of JAMStack projects. Most of my projects are JAMStack. I'll be covering what is JAMStack, and how did it get famous? What was the old way of developing things? I mean, not the old, but what are the other ways of developing the applications, and what are the newer ways of the developing applications with the JAMStack, and why should you choose to build your next application with the JAMStack instead of something like LAMP, MERN, Bean, or whatever. And when to use it. I mean, JAMStack is not a silver bullet. I will discuss when you should use it and when you should not use it. And also I will look at some of the workflows, how you can build a JAMStack application, what are some of the tools and services available, and how you can integrate into your projects. And also I will show you some of the examples and the pet projects that I have made with the JAMStack, and how we have been using at work the JAMStack applications. So before we jump into the JAMStack, you might know of some of the other stacks. So you might have worked with the LAMP stack. So this is Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. There's Mean stack, so Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node, and so on. There are a lot of stacks. There's Ruby on Rails. And then there's this JAMStack. So web developers love to throw these terms. So you might have heard SPAs, MPAs, multi-page applications, single-page applications, JAMStack. So JAMStack stands for mainly the JavaScript API, and the markup. So this is what the JAMS stands for. So any application that is built using this and follows a certain criteria that would be complying to the JAMStack. So in short, the JAMStack looks like this. So you have a simple markup. So you have HTML website with the JavaScript written into it, and that's it. This is your website. And then if you have to show some dynamic data or fetch some data from the server, you'll be calling through the API calls, using Ajax or whatever, and show them into the front end. So in short, this is what the JAMStack is. So you might say that this is just a static website. I mean, this is how is it different from the static website? Before I answer this question, static seems like a lot of loaded term. I mean, when you think about static, a lot of people think that static is really negative. But if you look at the definition for static means lacking in movement, action, or change, especially in a way viewed as undesirable or uninteresting. But static is not really a negative thing. It could be a positive thing also. So before I talk about static more, let me look at the dynamic website. So when you talk about the dynamic website, how does it look like? So there's someone sitting in the browser. They want to open your website. So how will you open the website? So they will request the website. The request will go to, first of all, the CDN, first of all. If they're able to find something in the cache, they will take it from there. Then the request will go to the load balancer. So then load balancer will pick up from multiple web servers that you have, that what is the web server that is available. And whoever is the most available web server who has the capacity, the request will be routed to that. And then the web server will be connected to the multiple DB servers, databases to fetch the data. And once it has got the data, it will come back, it will prepare the format, the HTML markup with the dynamic content embedded into it. It will get back to the load balancer, get back to the CDN, and then the response will go to the browser. If you see here, you have multiple steps. So around 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is the most simplest example. So there might be more stuff also. And also, like web servers, you have multiple web servers, you have multiple DB servers, you have multiple logics involved in here. On the other hand, if you look at the static website, so if you have a simple HTML website, the static website can be rendered just from the CDN. So all it has to do is the browser has to go to the CDN, fetch the data, and show it to the browser. So you don't have to go through these multiple steps in order to prepare the website to show to the user. You just have to go to one step, and that's it. So what is the benefit of this? So if you compare this with this format, like what are some of the benefits? So first of all, this having the website friendly to the CDN, it means that the website is closer to the edge, so closer to the user. So the user does not have to go to the multiple steps to get the website. It will just come here and then get the data, so it is faster. Then there's not much complexity. So if you look at this one, you have multiple items that you need to set up and you need to care about, and you need to make sure that they're working properly. But in the static website, you don't need to worry about all of this. You just have this one. And then the third thing is the reduced cost. You don't need to spend so much money on setting up this stuff. So I mean, if you look at the cost, if you have this setup, you need to care about, if you need to scale the website, you need to have more memory, you need to have more CPU power, and you need to have more capacity to request more handles, to handle more requests. So you have more cost in the dynamic. If you look at the static, you don't have much cost. And this is more performant. The static website is performant because it is closer to the user again. So you don't have to go through this 100 items to get that response. You just go to the one item and you get the response. And the last thing is that you don't have many points of failures. So in this case, for example, if your load balancer is not working, your website is gone. If your web server is broken or the DB server is broken, your application is gone. You can't access your website. But in this case, you just have one point of failure, which is not also a point of failure because it's CDN, which might also break. But I mean, there's only one point of failure. There are not many points of failures when it comes to the static website. So static is not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a good thing also. So what we saw here in the definition, so static is not any undesirable or uninteresting thing. So it could be a positive thing also. So if you're able to serve your website as a static website, so it could be a good thing for yourself also. Next, so this was for the static website versus dynamic website. But how about the stacks? So if we look at the stack, the most common stack is the LAMP stack. So for example, this is the stack that I have been using before using the JAMStack. So if you look at the LAMP stack, so if you see here, we have a lot of moving pieces. So first of all, we have a web server, which might be running Linux and as operating system. So for the routing, we are using Apache. So for example, Apache decides if there's a login request, I have to send the user to this page. If this is a registration request, I have to send the user to this page, and so on. So request comes here, then it goes to the PHP. So it might be a Laravel application, or you might be using any kind of framework like Symfony or something that is going to get connected to the MySQL or whatever database layer that you're using. So for example, if you're using PostgreSQL or MongoDB or whatever data layer that you're using, so PHP is going to connect to this database layer, get the data from here, prepare the views format. So for example, if you look at Laravel, so Laravel has this helper called view : render, which you pass the view file, the HTML file, the blade template, and you pass it the data that you want to embed into the engine, into the template, and then you return it. So this data will be prepared, this will get back to here, and then this will be returned to the user. And then this server is not necessarily going to be one server. So if you have more requests coming in, a lot of users on the website, you might need to scale up, and you might need multiple servers to handle the complexity and the growth. But if you look at the JAMStack, there's no concept of server. I mean, we have server, but it's just hosting the static website, static files. So it's not the server like this server running the Linux container, Linux operating system, and so on. So we have just server. It could also be a CDN. It has to return all of this HTML content, and all the heavy lifting has to be done in the browser. So browser gets the markup, then it runs the JavaScript. It does the manipulation that it needs on the markup that it receives. It may or may not need the data from the API, so it will call if it needs, get the data and just put it, and everything is done in the browser. So all these layers are gone. So if we compare both of these together, so if you see here, our stack has moved mainly to the browser side. So we are not doing all of this stuff on the web server. So everything is being done on the browser. So even if you have like 1 million users sitting on the website, it doesn't matter for us because the browser is doing everything for us. So it is the requests are not going to do through the server, through the preprocessor, the database engine, and all of this stuff. So what is the requirement for a JAMStack? So for some application to be conforming to the JAMStack, it has to follow this criteria. So it has to be pre-rendered. So pre-rendered means that you have to have the HTML files. So you don't serve, the request doesn't go to the server. You just have the HTML file, and everything is done on the client side. So there is no server execution, and the site may be progressively enhanced. So as I said here, the HTML got served to the browser, and the browser is just going to call the API if it needs, and then prepare the data and show it to the user. So progressive enhancement is not a requirement, but the server might or might not do this. The biggest benefit of the JAMStack is the deployments. We'll touch more of this. We'll discuss more on this in later slides. But in this case, let me quickly show you that what is the biggest benefit for me. So in this case, of whenever I need to deploy something, I have just one place to touch. I don't touch 100 places just to deploy my website. So for example, in this case, if I have a website, let's take the dynamic case. So if I have a dynamic website, and let's say that I want to change just the color of our footer that we have. In this case, when we deploy our dynamic application, we'll have to make sure that whenever we deploy, there might be some downtime, and there might be what if something breaks during the process of deployment. So there are multiple points of failures, but in this case, you just deploy to one place and that's it. You don't have to worry about the backend or the databases or this kind of stuff. So if you need to change the color, if you need to change the styling or the text, you just touch this one place. So why was there a need for JAMStack? So we'll discuss like how this setup is made and how you can build a website like this. But before that, like why was there a need for the JAMStack? So if you see at the usage these days, a lot of people are using the websites on the mobile phone. So rarely people, for example, if you look at the statistics from Twitter or Facebook or Google, like most of their applications or their services are being used through the mobile phone instead of the desktop application. So what does it mean? So it means that the mobile phone has to show the response immediately. So for example, the mobile internet might be slower. So there might be a lot of issues with the mobile phone, the size, for example, the download bandwidth. So there are a lot of issues that need to be catered when serving the data on the mobile phone. So to handle this, companies did a lot of things to improve this. So for example, Google introduced the AMP project, so which was also like the static representation of your dynamic website. So they cache your content and they just render it in front of the browser. So Facebook has instant articles. So if you look at the Facebook, for example, if someone shares a post and uh, if they keep sending the people out of the website, then every user has to go out of the website. They have to reload the server, request the data from the server, and render the articles, for example. But what Facebook does is it caches the content in the form of static website in itself and shows you just immediately instead of sending the user out of the Facebook to the external website. Apple is also playing with this format. So a lot of companies are doing this, doing changes and introducing technologies to cater for the mobile usage. And Jamstack is also one of the key features. So Jamstack also helps you cater for the mobile. So Jamstack is not something new. The Jamstack is it's a quite old technology. So for example, before, if you look at the 2010, 2008, or 2007, 9, 10, we used to develop the static websites in the beginning. But then, for example, later on, the dynamic websites came. WordPress started getting famous. There were a lot of dynamic websites, and then we started building the dynamic websites, and the static websites were not cool anymore. But in 2015, they were. I mean, after the launch of the single page applications and the frameworks, there was more push. There was push towards the static websites. So static websites were getting back into the picture. So the websites that were gone one time, they were coming back into the picture in 2015. But then there was a lot of backlash. So a lot of people started saying that the static websites are not cool. You cannot do this. There were a lot of issues with it. So there was a lot of backlash. But some of the people, they were still working on that. There were still companies working on the static websites. So for example, Netlify was one of the early adopters. So they were the ones who coined the term Jamstack. So they introduced the term Jamstack. And then this keep pushing it. They kept pushing it. In 2017, people started to notice Jamstack. A lot of companies started to build the applications in the Jamstack. So for example, Sequoia Capital, they were building their applications in Jamstack. Mailchimp started introducing Jamstack into it, and the Red Bull was also one of the early adopters. So then in 2018, there were more companies. So companies, there were products forming around the Jamstack. So for example, if you look at the Gatsby or Netlify or Contentful, they got massive fundings in their products. So these are the products we will look at more in detail. So they got funding and they got started promoting the Jamstack even further. And if you look at the last year, 2019, there are a lot of conferences, there are a lot of news articles, there are a lot of weekly newsletters on the Jamstack. So it's not a bad thing anymore. A lot of people are using it, and especially the serverless came, and it contributed to the usage of the Jamstack even more. We'll discuss how the serverless is used in terms of the Jamstack later on also. And if you look at the 2020, it's still early, but I think that it is still improving. So Jamstack is getting more and more used. A lot of people are using Jamstack in their applications, and it's getting quite even more used in the public. So about the Jamstack. So how does the workflow look like? We saw how it is built. We saw how the browser works and how the server renders the application in terms of a static website. But how does the workflow look like? So if you're developing a static application, a Jamstack application, how would you develop it? So there are multiple ways to develop a Jamstack application. The first way is in front of you. So if you look at here, so we have a local system. So you have a code base on your local machine. So you might have a build script written into your code base. So for example, if you are familiar with the JavaScript frameworks like React or Angular or Vue.js, you might have seen this yarn build. So this one that gives you the HTML file. So you run this command, you get the static assets. So what it does is it gives you the HTML files from your HTML and the JavaScript assets from the application that you have. And then you can preview the static assets on your local system. So for example, if you are using JavaScript, so there's a serve package that you might use to render the static assets, to render the static website on your local. If you're using, let's say, PHP, there's a built-in server, PHP -s. You can give it the local host and the port number to run the asset set. So you can run the assets locally on your system to understand how it is going to look like when it is deployed. So once you have it built, what you do is you take the assets and you go to the server and you just deploy it there. So this server is the static hosting. It's not like the dynamic hosting. So it goes to the static hosting. When the user comes, it goes to the, first of all, looks at the CDN. If it is able to find the website there, it takes it from there. Otherwise, it goes to the server and gets cached here CDN to again, and then it is rendered to the rendered and sent to the client. And then the consequent requests are gone to the CDN instead of the server. So this is the one way. So you build it, you generate the static assets, you run it on your local, you preview it, you see that everything is working fine. You copy all of this and you put it in the static server. So this copying could be, let's say you're using FTP like the old days, or you're doing it manually or something like that. So this is the first workflow. The second workflow is now we are looking at we are trying to automate it. The second way is the Git-based deployment. So what you do is, on your local system, you have your code base. You still have the build, and you run the yarn build, or you run the command that generates the static assets for you. And then what you do is you take those assets and you just preview and that's it. These assets are discarded. But what you do is you push your code base from your local machine to the Git. So git push whatever, and then your CI/CD server that gets the changes, your new code base, it runs the test cases, it generates the build, and then it automatically deploys your changes that you have to the static hosting. So you don't need to worry about anything. All you need to do is you just do your changes, push your changes to the Git, and CI/CD server will run the build, run the test, and if everything is passing, it will just deploy everything to the static hosting. And rest of the serving is still same. So this is the Git-based deployment. The third thing is, what if, so we are mainly talking about the dynamic and the static content right now. So in the last slide, we just saw that it's all just static content. So what if you need the data? So what if you have some database, or you have, let's say, the JSON content that you want to show to the users? How would you do that? Because in this case, you can't do that, right? So in that case, what you do is you use the content APIs. So on your local system, what you do is, when you run the yarn build, you make the API call to the content APIs. So this content API could be a headless CMS. It could be anything. Let's say it could be the API on top of WordPress, or it could be any services like Contentful, or any of the services. So this is where you put your content, and then this gets pulled in during the build, and the assets are generated. So this then gets pushed to the CI/CD again, and then the static hosting, the deployment is still the same. What if, so the next question is, what if there are changes to the content? So this is fine. I mean, you generated the build. At that time, you had something, let's say that you had a homepage and you had a banner on top saying, let's say we have a promotion 50% off. Let's say that later on you're increasing even more, you're giving more discounts. Let's say you're increasing the promotion to 90% off. So, but we have the old hosting, like old content. How would you update the content? Because we already deployed the build, right? Because it's a static website. So in that case, what you can do is you update in the Contentful, or whatever the headless CMS that you're using. You update your data there, and what it does is it makes the API call to your CI/CD, and it triggers the build, and the new build is generated with the content APIs by fetching the data from the content API, just like you fetch from the local. And then the new HTML file is generated, the new static assets are generated, and they're deployed automatically to the hosting. So this is the way that you can integrate the dynamic content into your website as well. The next thing is the development. How do you develop a JAMStack application? I will show you some examples also, some of the projects that I have built. But before that, how can you develop JAMStack application. So there are multiple ways. So if you look at the frameworks, so there is React, Angular, or Vue.js. These are the uh, most common frameworks that people are using. There are also others, but these are the most commonly used that you might have seen around. After that, there is also Gatsby, and in the backend side, the server side rendered and SSG, the statically generated frameworks are also there, like Next.js and Nest.js, and also there is Hugo or Jekyll. I'll show you some examples. My favorite is Next.js from these, and React.js from the front end frameworks, and I will show you why in a minute. So you pick these frameworks, you pick these tools, and then you build your application. So once your application is built, the next thing is you need to deploy it to some hosting to send it to the server, right? So to do that, there are multiple services. So you might have seen AWS. So you can deploy the static assets to the S3. You can use Zeet, which is now called Vercel. There's also Surge. Also, there's Netlify, and my favorite is the GitHub pages, because most of my projects are the toy projects, and I want to push them as soon as possible, and they're tightly coupled with the GitHub. So I use GitHub pages a lot. I will show you some of the examples. So these are some of the most famous examples that you might have heard of. So after building, you just deploy the assets to this hosting providers. But what about the content, which is this part, the content APIs that we discussed? So for the content, there are multiple services for that also. Some are open source, some are paid services. So most common ones are Contentful. There's Netlify CMS. There's Strapi, which is open source. There's Dato CMS. There's Sanity. So there are multiple content CMS services, or the services that provide you the headless content. So for example, Contentful, what they do is they allow you to create the types on the backend, and then you can put the data in there. For example, you can create a promotion banner, and you can define the type. So it might have title, it might have image, it might have body, and then you can put the content into that. And then this content has APIs, so you can call the API of Contentful and fetch this data and embed it into your website that you have. So this is for the serving content. Let's look at some of the examples. If we talk about the examples, let me show you some of the projects that I have built, first of all, with the help of the JAMStack, and before we jump on and discuss some of the public projects. So if I go to the roadmap, so this is the most famous website that I have, and you might have seen this already. So this is a website where I have the dynamic content. So these are the roadmaps that I have. So if you click front end, you have the front end roadmap. There are multiple resources if you want to learn the front end development, how you can do that. There's backend, there's DevOps, and there's Android stuff also. And then if you look at the guides, so there are these graphical explanations to the complex topics. So there are these dynamic guides also in here. So all the stuff there. So there are multiple pages. Then I have also the podcasts. So I have multiple pages in here. So this is completely static website. So daily I get around 10,000 visitors on this website, and I'm not paying even a single penny for this. So I'm only paying for the domain name that I pay to Vercel yearly, $90. Other than that, I'm not paying anything on this website, even though it's getting a good amount of people on the website on daily basis. So how is it built? So if I show you, so I want to make it easier to add the new guides. So because I make the new guides every week, I want to make it easier for me to add new guides. And I want to make it easy to contribute. So for example, if someone wants to build a new roadmap, if they want to add a roadmap, I want to make it easy for them to do that. So this application is built on top of the Next.js. And if I show you the website, so this is the code base. It's open source. It can be found on the GitHub. And if you look at the content, this is the content that I have. So if I go to the guides, so all of these guides that you see on this page, so these are all coming from this markdown files. So what happens is whenever I want to create a new guide, let's say this guide that I recently created. So this is about the open authentication that I added today, just now. like a couple of minutes, hours ago. So what I do is I just go, I write the markdown content, I put my image or whatever I have, I put the guide details into the guide.json. So if I show you this file, so this is the file containing all the guides that I have with the dates. So this is for the guides, and if you look at the content folder again, the pages are there also. I have the roadmaps in here also. If you look at the roadmaps, all these folders are the pages. So these are the ones that are converted into this blocks that I have on the home page. So these pages are coming from there. So if I look at the front end, for example, landscape.md, so this is just a markdown file containing the image. But if I show you, let's say, the Android roadmap, and if I open the landscape, so I have this textual content, I have a bunch of links, a bunch of images, and all of this stuff is getting converted into this format. But how is it getting converted? So what I do is whenever I want to add something or do something with it, I just go to my local, I put the content at the relevant folders. So if I show you my recent commit where I put the OAuth post, what I did was I just updated the guides.json file. I updated this file and I updated the image, and that's it. I just ran the git push, and that's it. That's all that I did, and this was automatically deployed to the guides page in this page. So all of this is done automatically. So how is it done? So GitHub has something called the workflows. So I have written a workflow. So what it does is whenever I push something, I have this deployment workflow. So it runs on the push on the branch master. So whenever you push something, what it does is it builds. So first of all, it installs the yarn, it installs the dependencies, then it generates the build. So what the build it does is it fetches the data from these folders, this content folder that I have. It generates the HTML, and all this HTML is then pushed into the website. So if I show you the gh pages, so this is where the GitHub pages take the HTML content. So what I do is I run the yarn build. So once it is built, I just deploy the I push the pages to the HTML generated build to the repository, which is in this branch. If I show you the GitHub-pages branch, it is not showing because I'm at the wrong file. This file does not exist in the GitHub pages branch. But if I go here and if I go to the gh-pages branch, you will see that all these files that I have. So if I show you this OAuth, so I have a guides folder. In the guides folder, I have the HTML files for all this content. So when you go to the website, I don't go to the server. So all of this stuff is rendered directly from the HTML files. So HTML file, let me show you the OAuth. So this is the HTML file that it generated. So it goes, the build process, it goes through all the pages that I have, and it generates the HTML files for all of them, and it just pushes them to the GitHub pages, which it deploys automatically. And just to show you one more thing, if I look at the actions, so these are the actions. So whenever I push something to GitHub, so this happens. So an action runs, and it runs the multiple steps that I have. So set up job, set up environment, build, and then deploy to GitHub pages. And this is how all the website is getting deployed without any of my effort. So this was one of the projects. So if I show you the code base, let's say if I show you the view page source, you saw that it was mainly the HTML file. So it was generated all at the build time, and there's nothing after that. But JAMStack, this is not the requirement for the JAMStack. I mean, JAMStack could be this. You can have a static website, which would still be called the JAMStack, but you can have dynamic website also. So if I show you one of my other projects, let's say this one. So this is another project that I have. It shows you all the trending projects. So you might know the GitHub trending page. GitHub trending page shows you the most starred projects in the day, in the selected period that you have, but they show only 10 or 20 projects, not more than that. So with GitHub, I take the selected period, and you can go as far back as you want, and it shows you all the trending repositories. In this case, this is also a JAMStack. So what happens is when you refresh, it makes an API call and it fetches the content and it just displays them in the browser. So if I, let's say, go to the next page, if I click here, load next day, if you look at this API call, this is not my server, this is the GitHub server. So the API call is going to the GitHub server, it is fetching all the repositories, it gets the JSON, and it just displays them in the browser. So this is another example of the JAMStack also. You don't have, so you may not have the HTML content at the build time, but you might want the dynamic content at the runtime, so you can fetch it in the browser also. So in this case, all of it is a dynamic, a static website. I am not doing any, I'm not owning any server. It is applied on the GitHub pages also. So this is where you, this is an example of a JavaScript heavy application where you don't have HTML files, you have the JavaScript heavy application. The last example of my personal projects would be this, my personal blog, which I'm not using anymore. I used to write a lot on this one, but now I'm focusing mainly on the roadmap.sh. So most of the content is there. But there's also an example of JAMStack. One more thing, the last one that I showed you, the GitHunt project, this was a React application. Before that was a Next.js, and that was a React application. But this is another JAMStack. This is written in Jekyll. Jekyll is a framework from Ruby for building the static websites also. So they allow you to do all this conversion from markdown files also automatically. So this is also deployed to the GitHub pages. So if I show you the GitHub pages branch, I don't have here. So if I go here, okay, never mind. I never touched it, so I'm not sure where it is. But it is also deployed on the GitHub pages, and they deploy it automatically. So whenever you push something, GitHub automatically GitHub pages run, and they deploy automatically to the GitHub pages. And this is written in the Jekyll. So JavaScript is not necessarily a requirement for the JAMStack applications. You can have also Jekyll or Ruby or any kind of application that is still a JAMStack. So in this application, I'm not using any JavaScript. It is a Ruby application that converts the markdown to to HTML files, and this is still a JAMStack. So this was my project that I have built. But now if we look at the most common, like the famous application that other people have built, the React.js docs, they are built with the JAMStack as well. So it's quite big application. They have a quite rich search, so you can go and search also. So what they do is in the search they call the Algolia. So Algolia, so I want to say that you can extend your static website with the other services also. So in this case, for example, this is a JAMStack application, but for the search, they give you a really powerful search, but for that they're using external third-party application called a service called Algolia. So they make the API call to Algolia, and they show you the results based on that. You can also use the third-party applications or services for the other stuff. So for example, if you might have a static website where you need a login and registration, you can integrate with, let's say, Auth0 or service like that, Okta or something like that. So there are multiple services that you can use to make your static website a dynamic website as well. There is more and more services that you can use these days. There's a repository on GitHub called Awesome JAMStack, which shows you there are a lot of links, useful links that you can use for the JAMStack. Vue.js is another example of similar application. This is also JAMStack. And then the last one is the Yarn package. Yarn is also built with the JAMStack. So it has really high traffic, and still they have built with the JAMStack. Another one is the Smashing Magazine. So this, I used to think that this is dynamic website. I mean, this is really famous, one of the famous blogs. It is quite old, and I was looking at the stats. I think they have around 4 or 5 million visitors per month, and this is still a JAMStack. And if you look at the load times, it is really fast, and the reason is because they have a statically rendered website built using the JAMStack. And they have, if you look at the website, they have a lot of pages. They have the job posting, they have the membership, they have search, and they have a lot of stuff, but all of it still is the JAMStack. So what are the benefits of the JAMStack? I think we covered already, so you might know already what are some of the benefits of the JAMStack. But the first thing is the security. So you might know from the, so you might remember from the last slide I showed you that there are a lot of moving pieces. So there's load balancer, there's a database server, there's a server for hosting, and there's a lot of places which you have to make sure that they are secure. But in Jamstack, you just have one place. There is also the CDN. So you don't have much to worry about in terms of security. The second thing is the developer experience. So from the development side, I showed you one example in terms of the GitHub workflow for the roadmap.sh. So I deployed with just one command. So the deployments are really easy. There's a lot of tooling available which can help you to make your workflows really powerful and easier. And also the next most important thing is the atomic deployments. In the old days, if you were using FTP, you might remember that when you were pushing something, so let's say that you had FTP server open and you were dragging the files from your desktop and you were putting them in the FTP server. So it might have happened that you might have a time where the website is not in the proper state. So you missed some of the files or something happened. So in that case, your website might be broken. So in this case, if you look at the Jamstack, we don't have the possibility of it doesn't happen at all because there's atomic deployment. So all goes at once. So there's not partial deployment in terms of the deployments. The third thing is the cost benefit. And I showed you the example for this for the roadmap.sh. So this website is getting, let's say, the 10,000 visitors per day, and I'm not paying a single penny for the hosting this. However, if it was hosted on, let's say, something like, if it was dynamic and if it was hosted on, let's say, AWS or something like DigitalOcean, I would have to pay definitely for this, for the traffic if it is growing. And also, I'm not worried about hitting the news hacker or hacker news the top page. So with my personal blog, I used to have a WordPress blog, and I was always skeptical about posting my stuff in there, that my if it goes to the front page, it will go down because the server might not be able to keep up. But this does not happen with the Jamstack, because you have a static website and that's it. You don't need to worry about scaling up or at all. The performance and scale, they're really performant because there's not multiple steps involved. There's just one place, and it is deployed on the edge server, so it is closer to the users. So in the CDN, so that's why it is really performant. So that load times are really faster. So it doesn't matter what kind of network the user is using, if it is opening on mobile or slow 3G networks, because it is static, it will still be fine. It will still be performant, and it can easily scale up. So to summarize the benefits, so first of all, it is secure. As I said, there's not multiple points that we need to think about when in terms of securing the application. It is really performant, and it can scale easily because it's static, that you can deploy with the confidence. There's atomic deployments. Also, you can revert easily because your front end is not coupled with the back end at all. So you have separate front end somewhere else. You can just deploy or revert whenever you want. Cost benefits is really cheap. The developer experience, it is really good in terms of that. So let's talk about some of the misconceptions. In terms of misconceptions, a lot of people think that when you're talking about Jamstack, it must be using JavaScript. So if you look at the J in the Jamstack, people think that J has to because of the J, it must have the JavaScript included. But it is not the case. You might have a website where you don't have JavaScript at all. Like I showed you my blog, the Jekyll based blog, it is not even using a single line of JavaScript, and it is still a static website, and it is still rendered on the CDN. The second thing is this is another misconception, that your application has to have less markup and it has to have more JavaScript. So if you're using the modern JavaScript frameworks, let's say you're building with React or Angular, or let's say Vue.js, you might see that in the markup you get this most of the time. and then you put the content in the browser. So when the application loads in front of the user, then the application starts getting enriched, and then there's uh, more activity on the application. While this is a JAMStack, but this is not necessarily a requirement. Application can still have the HTML as much as you want. It can still have the backend, and it can still have the HTML on some like the JAMStack on some of the pages instead of the full application as a JAMStack. So if I show you, but another common use case would be for this would be, for example, let's say that you have a marketing website, or let's say that you're running a SaaS application where you have a homepage, and then uh, all the homepage website pages are most necessarily going to be the static website. You don't need a server in this case. So in this case, for example, your client facing or the public pages can be the JAMStack, and you can still have the backend application or the part after the login stuff. It can still be the dynamic content that is not a JAMStack. So that's about it for the JAMStack. And if you have any questions or comments, and if you want to ask me anything, you can ask me now. You can leave them in the comments, and I will go through the comments in the live chat and answer them. Okay, or can you please put them again? I'm not able to find your question. Okay, I don't see any images with these JAMStack. We'll share the slides with you again, so you can look at the slides also. So I'll share the slides and the useful links somewhere, and I will share the link on my Twitter. I will announce that on my Twitter, so you can go and take it from there. Any CMS built with JAMStack. So CMS is just an example that you can use. For example, any external CMS like headless CMS to get the content from there. So for example, as I showed you the roadmap.sh, I mean, I'm using the content. I am not using some external third-party service, but I still have the content in the form of the embedded HTML. But you can still have some third-party service integrated, so I can create these roadmaps and guides on Contentful and can still fetch them from there with the API call. So there are multiple examples like Eleventy, and there is Contentful. There's a lot of examples that you can use. And what about the animation in the pages? So for the animation, you can still use the JavaScript on the client side. So you can still have the JavaScript on the browser as well. So it does not have to be the fully static website. So you can still serve some of the JavaScript in the application, and the JavaScript comes into the browser and still show you the animation and stuff. Like I showed you the example for the GitHub. So it is showing you the animations and the runtime API calls. So this is mainly with the JavaScript. What is the difference between the JAM and the SSR? So SSR is the server-side rendering. So SSR is not necessarily a JAMStack. So one more thing that I wanted to point out that I missed in the whole slides was that you don't have to religiously follow this JAMStack thing. You don't have to necessarily try to be fully JAMStack. You can still have SSR on some of the pages and still have JAMStack on some of the pages. So SSR is the case where you still have the server. So the first example of the dynamic website that I showed you, still the requests go to the server fetches the data, and it gives you back at the runtime the generated page. But in JAMStack, we don't have this. So in the JAMStack, the request doesn't go to the server to prepare the page. The page is already prepared for the user to see. So if I give you an example, so if I open the trading.com, this is the website that I work at. So most of the pages that we have on this side, like all the client-facing pages, so these are all the SSR. So if you refresh, so the requests still go to the server, and it prepares the data and fetches you the results back in the response with the proper HTML. But the pages like this, for example, let's say if you log in, this content does not have to be the server rendered. So this can still be the client rendered. So in this case, once you log in, so this stuff is still prepared on the browser side. So we return only the HTML and the JavaScript, and everything is prepared on the front end side in the user's browser instead of the server. So the JAMStack is front end only. Can we develop APIs with it? So JAMStack is relevant to the browser only. So it is mainly about the static websites. For the APIs, so it is completely another topic. So APIs building is something that you do, for example, let's say in the Node.js or whatever. So JAMStack is specific to the browser. It's specific to the static websites instead of the API. So APIs still are something else. Like you build the API, let's say you build the API with PHP or Node.js or something like that. Any other questions that you might have? How does JAMStack compare to SSR in terms of SEO? So in terms of SEO, so it depends upon the kind of JAMStack that you have. So if I show you this GitHub, this project that I showed you, this is not really good in terms of the SEO, because if you look at the page source, I'm only returning from here div id root. So there's no HTML in this case. So in this case, definitely it is going to affect the SEO. But if you look at the other example of this roadmap.sh, let's say, so in this case, so you get the full HTML with all the content in the page. So it depends upon the kind of JAMStack that you're implementing. So if you have a JavaScript heavy application that is rendered in the browser, so it might not be a good choice for the JAMStack for the SEO. So SEO will not really be good, but there are possibilities to generate the HTML at the runtime or at the build time and render still the JAMStack. So one other example for this is the Spectrum. So the JAMStack may not necessarily be a good option for you because Spectrum. I saw one of the tweets from the founder of this application, and they mentioned that they were using mainly the JavaScript application. It was fully rendered on the client side, and then they converted it to server rendered application, and they had a huge spike in terms of the number of people that were coming to the website. So definitely there are the downsides, but it depends upon the way that you're implementing your application. All right, people, I think that's it. If you still have questions, you can reach out to me Twitter at this handle, and I will tweet the slides and I will share more stuff and on Twitter also. So thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or email them. Thank you so much.